Welcome to ELT in Chile, a podcast about teaching English in Chile. And also, I talk to many different people from many different countries. And in this space, I talk to teachers, teacher trainings, and experts such as Gemma Archer. And in Chile, your name is pronounced Gemma. So, so here we share
You can call me Gemma if you like.
yes. So you're going here to share your experiences and also your expertise regarding English language teaching. So in this video episode, like I said, I'll be talking to Gemma Archer. So Gemma is an English for academic purposes teacher and a pre-sessional coordinator in the English language unit at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, Scotland. She's also the editor of the IATEFL Pronunciation Special Interest Group biannual journal Speak Out, which I have checked out, and it's super interesting, and also the Joint SIG coordinator. So Gemma holds a CELTA, deep TESOL, and a Master's of Research in English Language and Linguistics, and has taught English in the UK, in Ireland, Italy, and the Middle East. Maybe you will have to teach sometime in Chile as well, so you can complete your experience. So in her current teaching work, she specializes in pronunciation, phonology in an EAP context and as a standalone electives. However, her particular passion is in researching and teaching with diverse L2 and regional accents, particularly Scottish Standard English, and that's something that we're going to be discussing today. Her most recent research has included international L2 students' perceptions of diverse varieties of English and the effects of accent mismatch on teachers' motivation to teach pronunciation. So welcome to ELT, Gemma. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation to the podcast. And of course, as usual, I have many questions for you. So how are you doing, Gemma?
I'm very well. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, we're going to talk about one of your specific topics, pronunciation, and of course, teaching English. So the first question would be, how did you become interested and involved in teaching English? How did you start teaching?
I think, like a lot of L1 teachers, I didn't come from an education background at first. I had a love of literature and of languages. High school, I studied French and Italian, and I was never amazing at them. I was reasonable at them, but I loved doing it. I was very, very passionate about learning languages. And I went on to study abroad, and then I went to university and did my undergraduate in Italian and also in English. And when you study a foreign language at a UK university, normally you spend a year in that country to have an immersion experience. And this, of course, was before Brexit, when we had the lovely Erasmus program here. We don't have it anymore, but about 20 years ago, when I was doing my undergraduate, we did. Before I went off to Italy for my Erasmus year, my mum actually ran into one of my old tutors in the street and kind of gave him an update. And he said, "Oh, Gemma must try and get her CELTA before she goes away. It will give her opportunities beyond just studying while she's in Italy." And I took his advice and I applied and was successful and got a place on a CELTA course at the University of Glasgow. And the rest is really history. I went out to Milan for that year and I was studying. I had a place at the State University of Milan, but I was also teaching part-time. And I just realized that I loved working with people from all over the world. It was fascinating. It was so interesting to work with people. And I got to combine my love of languages. So that's really how it happened for me. The rest is history.
Yeah, very good. So you went from, let's say, teaching English. How did you become interested in, let's say, pronunciation specifically?
Really, it came from a lack of training. I look back on my CELTA and I always say to people, "Oh, we had an hour of pronunciation training on the CELTA," and my CELTA was a wonderful, positive experience, and I don't knock it for anyone. Great trainers, anyone who's taken a CELTA or trained on a CELTA knows how intense it is, how little time there is to fit everything in. So I don't think you can ever do everything to the possible extent that tutors really need. But for me, it was a real problem because the 1 hour we received in training, we were learning the IPA, but we were learning it using RP sounds. And this kind of led to a lot of confusion among the class of only Scottish teachers. And there was never any explanation or guidance or discussion about how we spoke versus what was being presented to us. So it just led to lots of confusion, very little practical resources in that first experience. And when I went into the classroom for the first time, not knowing what I needed to know, I just humiliated myself. I just did lots of really embarrassing, stupid things, and it put me off teaching pronunciation. And I didn't do it again for 8 years. For the first 8 years of my career, I did not teach pronunciation. I maybe thought I was if students were mispronouncing something and I corrected them, but I wasn't doing any integrated, explicit pronunciation teaching. And it was only when I came back to the UK and I did my DIP TESOL, my diploma, that was the first time, 8 years in, that I got any actual guidance on pronunciation pedagogy, but also reference to diverse Englishes, including my own variety.
Absolutely.
So that was the first time. And it was from there that I started to really think about pronunciation more. And then I was asked to teach an elective pronunciation course at the university where I work. So all of these things started to come together, and it really pushed me out of my comfort zone. And I had to start learning more and getting used to integrating pronunciation. So that's how it started.
Absolutely. I mean, lots of people have the same or face the same obstacles when they would like to teach, for example, listening. Like many people think it's just like a matter of just keep listening or continue listening, but there must be some guidance, or let's say writing. Those are skills that are difficult to
Absolutely.
let's say teach in terms of strategies. It's not just like a matter of repeating words and pronouncing words that your pronunciation is going to get better and better.
That's it. I think a lot of us know the bare minimum, drill difficult words, give students the IPA transcription. But beyond that, a lot of people don't know how to take it further. And of course, we know that students need a lot more than just a little bit of drilling on tricky words.
Exactly, like cup, cap, or things like that. Those minimal pairs, right?
Yeah, and they're helpful, but we need to do more.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would be like a good starting point, but yeah, we need to work a little bit more specific things like word stress maybe. And yeah, actually, yeah, I was reading one of your, let's say, last articles. Actually, you've written many interesting articles related to pronunciation, accent varieties. There was one, I read one of your last book chapters called The Effect of Prestige Models Familiarity on Students' Perceptions of and Interactions with Diverse English Accents. I don't know if you can tell me a little bit about this study, which is very interesting.
Yeah. It comes from my own experiences as an English language teacher, both here in the UK and abroad. I noticed probably for the first time, clearly I wasn't very observant in my early days of teaching because I was just scrambling to get lessons together and I wasn't really ready to kind of reflect on what was going on. But later in my career, I was teaching in Saudi Arabia. And I started observing and seeing and having funny interactions with students who were saying very negative things about my colleagues. Um, in Saudi Arabia, certainly when I was there, which was about 10 years ago, there was a very wide range of nationalities teaching English. People from the UK, from the US, from Canada, but also people who were, for example, British Somali, British Indian, British Pakistani, and a whole variety of nationalities and backgrounds. And students would say negative things about my colleagues, which is hilarious because they were thinking that I was the model, because they knew that I was from the UK. Oh, this must be the model to compare against, which I found very, very funny at the time. But it stuck with me. And certainly here as well in Scotland, this comes up all the time. Students' difficulties, how they're perceiving this new linguistic environment around them. They come to Scotland to study, knowing that it's clearly part of the UK and expecting the English here to be the same as in the other nations of the United Kingdom. So for many students, it's a real shock. They come with their IELTS 6.5 and then they step off the plane and they can't understand anyone. And they panic, because they lose confidence. They start to become shy to speak to people because they don't want to be embarrassed or have to be asked for repetition so many times. So I was very aware across my career that students were having their perceptions of different types of English were very diverse and not always in a good way, usually for the worst anyway. And so based on that, what I was hearing from them, I decided to run this study where students were listening blind. They didn't know where speakers were from. They had no information. They had to make judgments on speakers based purely on an audio recording. So they'd listen to the speakers. There was about 8 or 9 speakers. And then I gave them a series of questions. Which do you like the best? Which speaker would make the best English teacher? Which speaker sounds the most educated? Which sounds annoying? So giving them prompts that they then had to respond to. And what was interesting to me was the results that were coming back sometimes conflicted with what students were saying, sometimes. So students clearly, generally around the world, if they're studying English language, most people prefer the prestige L1 models, and that's usually received pronunciation or standard British English. And general American as well. They see these two, they hear these two in media, in their English language classrooms and their exams. They're surrounded by it. And because they're surrounded by these models, they become very familiar with them. And the more familiar they are, the easier they are to understand.
Absolutely.
And they prefer them. When we look at the results, they like what they are familiar with. And there's a correlation to how easy these people are for them to understand. So these prestige models in both that original study and in the replication I've done since, in both of these studies, students like what they know, they like what they're familiar with because they have lots of exposure to it. Before they got the chance to listen, I also asked students what they felt about different varieties. How easy is it for you to understand a speaker from the United States or from Scotland or an L2 international speaker? And often, especially for the Scottish speaker, they'd say, oh, it's impossible. It's so difficult. I can't understand anything. Then they would listen blind and actually give really positive feedback on the Scottish speaker. So it was interesting as well because it revealed that their perceptions don't always match up with their actual listening and feelings about what they've heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that sounds like a very interesting study. And also, I think I carried out a similar study here in Chile with pre-service teachers, and it was something similar. Like everybody wanted to improve their accent in a way. But the next question was, how would you like to improve it? Like, what ideas do you have? And they would say, I would like to sound like a person from the UK. Okay, but where from? No, like a person from from England. It's like, well, which region? And so they have this idealized version of what an accent should sound like, and probably what they would watch on TV or something like that.
And what's also fascinating is knowing that they usually have this preference. When presented with them, they really struggle to identify where these speakers are from. Yeah. They knew they had a preference, but they couldn't say, well, this is a speaker from the United States. So they couldn't locate what country these speakers were from, which I think is very revealing, that they say, I want to speak this way, but when they hear that accent, they can't identify it. So it's really interesting, isn't it?
And do you think that this perception, let's say, has changed, or do you think that still like these two models that you mentioned, like RP or General American, are still those like that people actually, I don't know, are teaching, or those are the ones that people are striving to learn, or do you think that has changed a little or a lot?
I think it is changing a little. I think compared to where we were when I started teaching, I think things are definitely changing. But it's difficult to judge. I'm sure you're the same, because I know that you're a prawn person too, because we're in an echo chamber. So we're surrounded by people like us who are very positive about teaching pronunciation and diverse varieties. But I think that outside of this, I think things are moving a bit more slowly. I know that I think publications, English language teaching publications and resources they have a huge role to play in this. And we know recent studies have come out in the last year or so that publishing houses are still, a lot of publishing houses are still relying on these prestige models. They're still pushing these prestige models. I know that some textbooks have started to change. For example, National Geographic Voices. I'm hearing a lot of positive feedback about that and its inclusion of international speakers. But I think that when the course materials that are used in the majority of classrooms, when they catch up, I think we'll see a bigger, more, a larger transformation in people's attitudes towards different varieties of English.
Absolutely. And also, let's say, well, everybody's worried about their pronunciation. Everybody would like to improve it at some point, but it's kind of difficult to, let's say, let students know, or actually when you ask them and when you have deeper questions, and then you start, let's say, hearing words like, this sounds more formal, this sounds more educated, this sounds like too informal, this is difficult to understand, like you were saying, like some negative or positive. So it's like let's say, some sort of like two sides of this story. Like it's either very positive or very negative. There's no like in between.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's the goal, is for it to be the norm rather than the extreme.
Absolutely. Are you working on something at the moment? Are you doing some research at the moment or writing about pronunciation?
I just mentioned I've just finished replicating that particular study about the perceptions and interactions of. I haven't written up the second version yet, so that's on the to-do list. But the results were very, very similar to the first study, which was, that's the kind of result that you're hoping for, consistency within a variety of students. I'm also writing up a piece at the moment on pronunciation assessment. We just had a ITEFL pronunciation SIG, which I'm part of. We just had a conference on pronunciation assessment earlier this month. So I'm writing up a piece about that, which will come out next year. And what else am I doing? Oh yes, I'm actually, for my own students, and well, for the wider variety of people that are coming to Scotland for work and study. I'm in the middle of creating a bank of video resources, which will go online, to try and improve exposure and familiarity to what people are hearing when they come here. At the moment, like as we've just said, everything is so much oriented around RP or General American, and so there's no support here for students who are struggling to understand what they're hearing. So I'm in the middle of creating a bank of video resources that kind of identifies key features and explores and gives examples. So that will hopefully be ready and coming up in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's say something you mentioned at the beginning. Do you think that, let's say, many teachers are reluctant to teach pronunciation because they don't know how to do it, or because they think that teaching pronunciation can be a little threatening for them?
I think both. Certainly, the fundamentals are not always there, and that's not through teachers' fault. That is through the fault of providers, training providers who haven't yet caught up. We've seen a lot of research in many different countries, particularly for teachers who are L1 speakers. They are not provided with this basic pronunciation pedagogy. What do you need to teach and how do you do it? What's the method and the technique? So there's definitely an absence of that important fundamental basic skill. But also what I found certainly in my own area is that there's also a lack of confidence due to accent mismatch sometimes. So I've done research with regional speaking teachers from Scotland and Ireland and other parts of the UK. And this keeps coming up again and again. Having materials only available in RP, Standard British English, means they can't use them the way they're supposed to be used. They have to go away, rearrange things, try and find a different model, alter the activity. And for teachers that have 20, 25 hours of contact time per week, they don't have time to go and find all these resources, which means that instead of teaching pronunciation, they're doing something else. Or they think this is, I'll get an audio CD instead when I want, or recording off the internet instead of a prestige speaker rather than do it myself. Because they've never had that kind of instruction and training at the beginning. So I think it's a very common problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that would be one, let's say, materials. And also, like you said, it's just easier for many people just to find, let's say, something that, has this specific accent like RP or General American, because it's more available. So it's just, let's say, basically easier to just do that. But it doesn't mean that it's just a better, let's say, a better idea. And do you think that, are there any other challenges that you think teachers face when teaching pronunciation? Let's say, in your experience, are there any other, let's say, challenges or difficulties?
Something that I hear a lot is, oh, Gemma, give me a good resource. I know I need to teach pronunciation, but I don't know what to do. And again, this is just a very basic thing, is knowing what your students are struggling with. And that can come either from an awareness of their mother tongue. And, for an L2 speaking teacher who's in their own country working with students with the same mother tongue, you immediately have knowledge of the features that they may struggle with and need extra help with. So using that as a guide to help you is one way of finding what needs to be prioritized in the classroom. If you're working outside of that environment, if you have a multilingual classroom, doing a very basic diagnostic test, asking students to read a paragraph and send you a recording, can really help alert you to any features that really need to be worked on in class. No one has enough time to do everything they need to in the classroom, pronunciation especially, because people think it's an extra. They have to wait to find time to fit it in. So if you know what your students are struggling with from the beginning, you can point it out whenever it comes up in class, in the listening recording, in the reading text that you do, in the writing homework. You can highlight these problems frequently and recycle them and give students as much exposure as they need. So I think that's another very kind of fundamental thing that not every tutor has knowledge of, actually beginning that process.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, you need to know, let's say, at least, for example, here in this case of Chile, where people speak Spanish as a first language, there are some features that are, key, like the difference between, very and, I don't know, berry, because we have the same pronunciation for that sound, or the sounds like thank you that do not exist here in Chile, at least, and yeah, word stress and things like that. So we have to focus on that. But let's say, in terms of, in my experience, students, they really want to sound, let's say, more native like, and they usually asking for resources that, talk about connected speech. It's like, how do I connect this? Because when people speak, they sound like they're connecting everything. But it's kind of funny that you say that people are looking for one specific resource that is going to help them solve all the problems.
Yeah. Does it exist?
No. And let's say also, I would say maybe it's also something maybe that has to do with self-confidence, because the teacher is the main pronunciation model in the classroom. So that accent is going to be the one that will be, let's say, the pronunciation model. So do you think that teachers can be a little afraid to teach pronunciation because they are the model, and they're being judged all the time?
Yes, absolutely. We hear it a lot from our L2 speaking colleagues when I'm doing, work with Pronsig. So I definitely think there's a fear of being outed as not, teaching pronunciation, but not having a perfect native speaker accent yourself. And there's a lot of judgment around that as well. But we know that we don't need to have a native speaker accent to be understood, to be intelligible to others. And for our students, and I'm sure you know this just as well as I do, how many of our students are actually going to be going to a native speaker country and using English? I mean, sure, they may go on holiday one day, or they may spend a little bit of time there, but how many of them are going to be learning English with a native speaker accent and then going to that country? It's not really how English is being used these days. We know that English speakers, that there's more L2 international speakers of English than L1. let's prepare our students for that reality, that they are going to be encountering other speakers with different accents from different countries. And that's okay, because we can make ourselves clear, we can accommodate our accent so that we can all understand each other. And so I hope certainly that with international L2 speaking English language teachers, I do hope that as we go forward, as materials improve, as there's more awareness of this topic, that there is less pressure on L2 speaking teachers that they have to first have a perfect accent before they can teach pronunciation. It's just not the case. And people say to me all the time, oh, do your students, when you teach them pronunciation, do they have a Scottish accent? No, they don't. They see me 2 hours a week. We're not focusing on accent. We're focusing on features to improve clarity and to improve intelligibility. You do not have to have a native speaker accent or a prestige model accent to teach features that improve clarity and intelligibility.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, yeah, that would be one of the let's say key points, that you're not, unless you would like to be an actor or you would like to specialize in acting, that you will have to really produce an accent perfectly. But I think there are some concepts that are easily confused, like like you were saying, when somebody wants to improve their accent and then you say, but how? I would like to sound like you. It's like, okay, you will have to let's say record me probably, and I don't know, spend a lot of time with me and I can help you, but I don't know if that goal would make sense.
And a lot of that comes down to clarity. I think so many teachers have that exact experience. Yeah. I want to sound like you, teacher. Well, why? Because you're easy to understand. It's not because they know that their teacher speaks perfect English with a perfect accent. It's because they're easy to understand. That is something we can work with. We know that there are things that we can teach and activities we can practice to make someone easier and clearer to understand. That's something that we can do.
Absolutely.
Easily.
Yeah. And in, let's say, in your own experience as a teacher and, let's say, researcher, do your students ask you, let's say, okay, can you teach us some features of Scottish, accent or pronunciation, or do they want to sound like more Scottish like, or it's not something that happens in the classroom?
This comes up all the time. It's very, very rare that anyone wants to sound like a Scottish speaker, and that's fine. Everyone has their own goals, their own objectives. I always ask students, why do you want to sound a certain way? Some really interesting responses. Normally they ask me in terms of, I heard this, but I didn't understand this, or why are Scottish people so difficult to understand? So more in terms of comprehension and perception, that's the type of thing that they ask about normally. When they say they want to have a native speaker accent, obviously it's not my place to judge someone else's goals or objectives. I ask them why. Usually I hear, because I will get a better job when I go home. Yeah. Of course, I'm thinking when you go home to your home country, people are going to be listening to you, identifying you as having a native-like accent, and therefore employing you. I don't say this to them, but this is the type of thing I'm thinking in my head. Only once have I heard, and again, it's not my place to judge, but only once have I heard a very realistic reason for someone really wanting to attain a native speaker accent. And it was from a master's student who was studying to be a counsellor, like a psychologist or a counsellor. And he actually had research to say that the voice of the counsellor can have an influence on the client, the patient. And he said, I want to be effective and I want to give my patients, the very best experience they can have. And if they're struggling, if they hear something that's different and unfamiliar to them, that might not be as effective. I haven't read that research myself, but I thought that's a justifiable response,
Absolutely. And I know that you talk a lot about, let's say, perceptions, from both sides, positive or negative, when it comes to certain accents or varieties. Have you found, let's say, something very surprising or maybe something controversial when it comes to, let's say, accent perception or how people perceive a specific, a variety?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it earlier, the correlation between the accent that you're most familiar with and the accent you like the most. it should be common sense, I suppose, but it's interesting to see it in black and white, and also this real struggle to identify where people are from. I'm a language learner myself. That should be pretty easy for me to identify and to know. But it's still interesting where you see that consistently coming up in results, and I feel a bit more justified to question students, or at least to ask them about their reasons for wanting to sound native-like if they can't identify a native-like accent or native accent itself.
Absolutely.
So I found that quite interesting with regards to perception. Another interesting thing, I suppose, is that perception is not just about hearing a foreign accent or a foreign language. It happens within our own. You're a Spanish speaker, and I know that this is the case for Spanish speakers too. Perceptions of different types of Spanish, different varieties of Spanish. And if you're not familiar or accustomed with a certain type, you're going to struggle you may struggle a little bit more to understand it. That's the same in my country. It's the same if I were to go to another part of the UK or abroad in an English-speaking country. So this is not just something for the L2 speaker. This is something much broader that happens to all of us within our own languages as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are two things I would like to say about that. One of them is that, let's say, when people, for example, in my case, hear me talk, they cannot place me. They cannot say, "Oh, you're from Chile." It's impossible unless I tell them I'm from Chile.
Okay.
Yeah, and the second,
is that because, like many teachers, you maybe have, less or fewer regional features in your Spanish?
absolutely. I mean, I'm talking about English. I'm talking about English.
Okay.
I'm referring to English.
Okay.
And in terms of, let's say, Spanish, we have like the same idea that, let's say, I hear that a lot, that, and this becomes like a sort of myth that Chilean accent is very difficult to it's impossible to understand, that it's very difficult to understand. And it's basically something that, and again, it's when people try to imitate us, and it's kind of funny, of course, but they can never, let's say, imitate us. But that there are some features that are very, specific and things like that. But again, it's like it becomes like a myth, probably, because there is a lack of exposure. Probably materials usually comes from Spain or from Argentina or from Mexico, in the case of Spanish. So it's very difficult to talk about, let's say, that. And like the case you were saying about Scotland, it becomes like a sort of, like this language myth, that languages are impossible. This is more difficult. It sounds, I don't know, worse, or British accent is more formal or more sophisticated.
Absolutely. My colleague, Robin Walker, who's a very influential trainer and researcher in pronunciation, who's now retired, he had a wonderful tip for me, and he's talked about it before. He lives and works in Spain with Spanish speakers, and his tip was always to ask students to consider accents in their own mother tongue. Name an accent that's considered really formal. Name an accent that's considered not, something that people don't want to sound like. And just asking students to explore different varieties in their own language first, and then using their reaction as a kind of connector or bridge into varieties in English, just to kind of show the parallel that these perceptions exist everywhere, and they're often a social, they're socialized into us. It's not always based on reality.
Absolutely, and that, let's say, that has, of course, an impact on, like you were saying, on the type of pronunciation students, let's say, or the system that they would like to let's say, to select, when actually becoming, speakers. So that's why they would say, I would like to sound like a person from a specific country, because that sounds easier. Like that's something I can understand more, let's say, more easily.
Absolutely.
And let's say, compared to that, in Chile and I would say Latin America, the notion of RP, I mean, if you go to a pronunciation class, probably you're going to be surprised that is still pretty prevalent, here in Chile. Let's say, what do you think about this? Do you think what would you say about that?
It's not actually a surprise to me. We have lots of wonderful colleagues in Fronsig from all over South America, many from Brazil, from Argentina, from different places. So this is something that they've actually reported as well. And I've heard also through the grapevine different people saying it's not even just that people are only having access to prestige models. In the case of RP, it's like old RP that's being taught. It's
Yes.
not even modern day RP, which is, it's fascinating. And sometimes you do hear students coming through with these archaic sounds and lexical items, which really are surprising. But then you remember, well, there are other parts of the world which are still using these older systems. Um, I think change will happen slowly, as it has started to elsewhere. South America is not the only place in the world with this. My colleagues and I have talked about it a lot in regards to Poland and Russia and other places as well, have a close connection with these more prestige forms. Change will happen. I think it will be slow, but as I mentioned before, when resources start to change, when that filters down into the everyday classroom, I think the change will happen more. But yeah, it's a really interesting an interesting situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think like I agree with you. Even though like slowly a change, let's say, is coming, and also with the let's say teachers are being trained in other countries. Myself, I did my master's in Belgium, so we have so many different experiences, and we try to let's say bring back all those experiences and say why are we teaching pronunciation in this way? Like we shouldn't be doing this, let's say, in this way, because we are in a more international setting right now. Like you said, like most people are, I mean, if you would like to study in the UK, that's fine, but most people are just going to work in, let's say, here in Chile, but with people who speak English, basically.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think now the other thing that's helpful is obviously the internet. We're not as limited as we once were to the CDs and cassettes that have these kind of voices. And now again, we have free resources as well, websites, YouTube channels, where we can seek out different accents, different varieties, and bring them into class. So I think, yeah, that helps enormously, and I think it will. And as you say, with trickle down training, like you mentioned, people starting to go into classrooms and teaching organizations and share this kind of information. Yeah, I think it will definitely change will happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And also I think, let's say my experience as a student, and also of course as a teacher, and many of my students who have studied abroad, when they hear people, let's say, use English, they say, but they don't worry so much about the pronunciation, so why do we worry so much about it? So, and it's like, why do we focus so much on that? And I'm like, I don't know, that's something that has been maybe like this idea that you have to sound as native like as possible when it's not really necessary. If you're intelligible, that's fine. If you're clear enough, that's also okay.
Yeah, and we all know there is still some resistance to that. Good enough is good enough. I've studied languages, and I don't know if it was as much of a big deal to me when I was studying Italian, for instance, that I must sound like a native speaker. But I think different times and different languages and the way that English is used is quite different to the way, for example, an English speaker might speak Italian. So it's definitely an interesting situation.
Absolutely. And just to finish up, Gemma, what resources, or let's say, can you suggest for teachers that are watching us and to this podcast in terms of pronunciation? What are some resources you would say, like, oh, check this out, or maybe a website, or maybe a book?
Well, shameless plug, of course.
Yeah.
I have to mention some fantastic teaching organizations that you can join and become a member of. Of course, I mentioned IATEFL Pronunciation SIG. That's not the only one. That's just because I'm a member of it that I'm mentioning it. There's TESOL SPLIS. There's BRAS TESOL for teachers in Brazil. So there are teaching organizations in lots of different countries that have special interest groups, and pronunciation and phonology is often one. Joining a teaching organization was absolutely fundamental for my career. It changed everything. The amount of resources I suddenly found, and the people I had access to, and the training and the workshops. So if you can, I would absolutely recommend joining a teaching organization, and that will get you started and point you in the direction of lots of other resources. Something else that I use all the time and I absolutely love when it comes to pronunciation is the color vowel chart. That's produced by English Language Training Solutions in the US. And it's a lovely practical resource, but one that they are very, very keen on being seen as acceptable and adaptable in all kinds of English settings. So it's not just about reproducing a general American accent. It's something that's adaptable for all types of Englishes, and they have different charts to represent different models as well. I absolutely love that resource and I use it all the time. It's lovely and practical. So yeah, I suppose they're my top two: joining a teaching resource, thinking about something practical like that. Also, Mark Hancock is a big, well-known pronunciation expert, member of PronSig. He has a wonderful range of resources on his website. He's known as Hancock MacDonald, and he has a great range of textbooks called PronPack, and he has one for Spanish speakers as well. So if pronunciation is something that you're still a bit unfamiliar with, a resource like that, you can learn very quickly and bring it into classroom and start trying out things, and just experimenting and becoming more comfortable with it, I think is great. There are more resources available now than there ever was, and I see more and more coming onto the market. So you don't have to suffer if you don't have the training. There is more being published every day to help you get used to and become acclimatized and familiar with pronunciation instruction.
Absolutely. I mean, like joining an organization or basically talking to people who are, let's say, doing some sort of research in the same area that you are. It's also key. Basically talking to other people from, let's say, other countries, because sometimes we think that we have let's say, for example, in Chile, we may have the same, only us has, let's say, we have the same issue when it comes to pronunciation, but it's basically everywhere. We face the same challenges, so it's not. And then how we can tackle those issues, let's say, with other people from other countries. I think the internet has actually helped us, let's say, doing that a lot.
It's so liberating when you realize that it's not just you. Everyone has this problem. And even now, I feel quite comfortable with pronunciation these days. But even now, I still turn to my colleagues in PronSig and go, I call this. Is that what you call it? Did you learn it a different way? Because we all have the same knowledge, but we've come to it in different ways and from different routes. So having people that you feel comfortable to ask for help or ask for recommendations, that's the beauty of being involved in a teaching organization, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So that's why, let's say, we have this podcast, because, let's say, in a way, I interviewed Mark Hancock like, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and it was something, let's say similar, like the idea of sharing, and let's say people like to share what they do,
Mm-hmm.
So because it's also, let's say, in a way, helps us understand that, like you said, we're not the only ones going through the same issues, but everybody, in a ways, we're trying to solve the same problems, And I've talked to people from other areas, and it's kind of, let's say, similar.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. My L2 speaking colleagues and I, we have the same problems, the same difficulties. So yeah, we achieve an understanding together.
Absolutely.
Working together. So that's the best part.
Very good. So that concludes our video episode with Gemma Archer. So I'm going to say Gemma. Gemma, thank you for sharing your experiences and ideas in this episode. It was a lovely conversation. And of course, I can invite you again in the future. So if you have any questions or comments, you can reach us at podcast@eltinchile.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can visit our website with full of resources and, of course, interesting interviews, www.eltinchile.com. So Gemma, thank you very much for your time. I don't know if you would like to you have some closing remarks.
Just have a go with pronunciation, everyone. Just try something simple. You don't have to know the IPA perfectly. You don't have to know difficult things like intonation contours. Just try a little bit and test the waters and see how you feel. Get comfortable with pronunciation.